So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the book In Harm's Way by Doug Stanton. I chose this book because the story really interested me, and my dad actually recommended it to me, and I felt that it fit the category that we were supposed to go for. So I'll go ahead and jump in with just a little bit of background and a little short summary of the book. So basically, the book is a nonfiction book, and it's about the ship called the USS Indianapolis and this journey that it had to go on that was actually this very top secret mission, and how the ship ended up sinking, how things went wrong, and the journey that it took across the Pacific Ocean that led it to disaster. So firstly, probably one of the most important points of the book is to talk about Officer Charles McVay. He was the commanding officer of the USS Indianapolis for this specific journey, and the president actually requested for him to be the commanding officer because he had had some previous experience, obviously, but specifically in some of the earlier battles of World War II, and they were impressed with the way that he manned the ship, and they thought that he could successfully make this journey. He was assigned to this mission, and all he really knew about the mission when he was first assigned was that he was going to be carrying some cargo that he would soon learn about, but that the rest of the crew could not know about. And he was given a letter, and in that letter, he saw that he was going to actually be carrying parts for the atomic bomb, the first atomic bomb that was used in World War II. And so he took this journey on the ship, and he was very nervous about it because he was actually supposed to have an escort with him, or that's what would have been normal protocol. But since the president and the government wanted to keep the mission completely top secret, they actually explained to him that they didn't think that he should have an escort, so that way there wouldn't be attention drawn to him. He was very, very against this. He thought that it was a really, really bad idea to travel all this way and in such a big ship that would be easily recognizable to enemies without any kind of protection. But the president and the government insisted, and so finally they got him to agree. And I'll go into more in the rest of the PowerPoint what went wrong, but as you probably know, as I explained, one of the points of this book is that the ship did sink. It was hit by 2 missiles from a Japanese submarine. And so he actually ended up being very much blamed for this. The government claimed that he did not follow the proper zigzag pattern that would have kept the ship from being hit, and so he actually became the first and only naval officer to be court-martialed for losing a ship sunk during an act of war. A lot of people and a lot of his crew did not agree that he should have been reprimanded in this way, but it didn't really matter. They still decided to follow through with it, and although he was one of the only about 300 surviving members of this sinking, he actually ended up taking his own life when he was about 70 because of the guilt and shame that he felt for what had happened and being the only naval officer to be court-martialed. And so he faced a lot of mental health problems that sadly led to him ending his own life. So I'll talk a little bit about the journey. I have a map right here that says the final mission of the USS Indianapolis, and the USS Indianapolis had been brought to San Francisco because of some damages that it had faced in an earlier battle, but it wasn't sunk. They were pretty minor damages, and so it was very easily brought to San Francisco and fixed. This happened on July 16th, and they departed from there on July 16th, and they made a small stop in Hawaii to refuel, and then continued their route to the island of Tinian, which is where they would be delivering the atomic bomb parts. And something important to note is that the president and the government had told Captain McVeigh that when he got to Tinian, he would be given an escort from Tinian to his next location because he wouldn't have those bomb parts anymore. So while they still didn't want to draw attention, it was not as important of a matter anymore because those parts weren't on board. They would be successfully delivered. And so that was part of McVeigh's terms, is that he would have an escort of ships to make sure that they safely arrived at their end location. But he got to Tinian, and they dropped off the parts, and when they got there, it was explained to them that they were not going to have an escort. Captain McVeigh was pretty upset about this, and he tried his best to argue it, but at the end of the day, they refused to give him the escort and told him to go on his way. And he was directed to travel to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, and he was just expected to get there safely without anybody watching over him or anything. And this was such a top secret mission that when the ship sunk halfway between Guam and Leyte, nobody really knew. And so the torpedoes hit the submarine, and it was sunk in about 12 minutes, leaving the men on board to abandon ship when they realized they had no other options. A lot of men were obviously forced to jump overboard, and they were able to grab life jackets, some of them, and as the ship was going down, a few men were able to get some of the lifeboats free, but not all of the lifeboats that would be needed to make sure that they survived. All of them. So in the initial sinking, about 900 men survived and were able to jump down into the water out of 1,200. So a good portion of them died just while the ship went down. There were some that were in cells in the lower prison that couldn't escape, and there were some that were obviously just hit with the missiles and had no chance of surviving. The men in the water were scared and frightened, but they remained calm because they figured that when the ship didn't arrive at Leyte, that would be reported to the president and to the government, and that they would be rescued very, very soon. And there was an officer on board who believed that he had gotten a distress message out in time before the ship sank and he had to jump overboard that would also save them. So they were pretty surprised when they were 1-2 days in and nobody had come to rescue them yet. Some of the men were fortunate to be near some of the life rafts, but others were not. There were large groups, including one of them was 400 men, in which all they had was life jackets, and some of them didn't even have that luxury. And so for the life rafts that they did have, with the groups that had them, the men would take shifts getting in them, or the most injured men would stay in the life rafts. And there were those initial injuries from just the torpedoes hitting and the sinking of the ship, but later on there would grow to be more injuries, including shark attacks. There was a lot of blood in the water from the injuries the men had faced while being on board, and that attracted the hungry sharks. And so a lot of men were eaten by sharks, a lot of them just bit and badly injured. And, some of them were fortunate to be able to have a spot in the life raft, but others who only had life jackets were not so fortunate. Some of the men floated on pieces of the ship also, but that wasn't very practical either. And after a few days, dehydration, hallucination, hypothermia set in. Some of the men were so thirsty that they kind of forgot that, you're not really supposed to drink seawater, but they were so thirsty in their head, in their delusion. They really thought that it would help them, but that just led to more dehydration. And at night, it would get cold. And so these men suffered for days and days, 4 days to be exact, wondering and waiting for somebody to come and rescue them and not understanding why that. So the ship was finally found after 4 days floating at sea, but it was completely on accident. On August 2nd, an anti-submarine plane discovered the ship, or discovered the men left over from the ship, during their routine patrol and radioed for help. These guys were in a plane. They had no idea that the men of the USS Indianapolis were going to be out there. They were simply on their regular path. Nobody really knew that the USS Indianapolis was out there. So when the men in the plane saw the remnants of the shipwreck, they had no idea who it was, and they had no idea that a ship was even supposed to be out there in that area of that large of a capacity. Of the 1,200 men, only about 316 survived, which is a lot to think about because they were in regular protocol. They should have had an escort, and also in regular protocol, the ship should have been reported missing when it never showed up late. But the U.S. dropped the atomic bombs on August 6th and August 9th, and the government kept the sinking of the ship quiet until August 15th, even though the ship was found on the 2nd. So many believe that the president and the government, realized that the ship hadn't made it to late and that it had sunk, but they decided to keep that under wraps because they didn't want it to be a huge thing, because they knew really on their part that they had made a big mistake. And so they kept it to August 15th to ensure that the news of Japan surrendering would completely overshadow the ship sinking. And it really wasn't a super big part of history and not something that a ton of people know about. It's pretty common knowledge, but it's not something we're really always taught about in history class, even though it was a big mess up on the government's part. And so, as I talked a little bit about before, Captain McVeigh was court-martialed for failing to maintain a zigzag pattern, and that led to a rapid mental health decline that resulted in suicide, even though many of his crew members fought for him and believed that the military had made the captain a scapegoat for their own faults, because obviously he fought and argued for this escort, and while him maintaining the zigzag pattern could have potentially stopped the torpedoes from hitting the ship, it also could have been avoided if they had had an escort, and not nearly as many men would have died if the ship had been reported missing. In the year 2000, 55 years after the sinking, McVeigh's name was finally cleared by Congress. It's a little sad to think about because he had already taken his own life years and years earlier, and so he didn't really get to feel the relief of that being lifted off of him, and it still affected his mental health so bad to cause him to take his own life. But it's good to hear that his name was cleared, especially after all of just the horrible things that he had to go through and survive. And so obviously there are still some remaining crew members that were probably very happy with the fact that he was finally let off the hook. And to finish things off, and to talk about a specific remaining crew member, there are about 8 survivors of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis still alive today. And when I was doing some research, I discovered that one of the survivors actually lives about 30 minutes from my hometown. I was reading up on some articles, and I saw one that was written by the Johnson City Press. And I was really confused because Johnson City is the city that I lived in before I came here for college. So I clicked on the article, and it explained that James Smith lives in Mount Carmel, and he is one of the only survivors left of the USS Indianapolis. I thought that was very interesting. He talked a little bit about what he was doing on the ship that day, and basically he was asleep before the torpedoes hit, actually. And so he was awoken and just to this huge shock. And it's just crazy to think that he lived through and endured all of this and is still alive today to speak of it and lived so close to where I used to live. And so I just thought that that was really interesting. And, you know, it really is a small world, I guess. But that was just a little bit about the book. I could probably go into much more detail, but I only have, obviously, 15 minutes. And so I would definitely recommend it. It's a really, really cool story. I'm not exactly the biggest fan of history, but this story really caught my eye and really kept me engaged. And so I liked it a lot, and I would definitely recommend it to all of you.